Arrogance. This killer risk is an attitude of invincibility that you sometimes see in individual people or in units or departments or business segments or even organizations as a whole. So first of all, they're politically difficult. Who wants to hear that they're arrogant, or what organization wants to hear that the culture has a level of arrogance in it? Easily identifiable. So this is readily apparent to external parties. Usually there's some externally observable basis for it. They've achieved awards, they have a lot of recognition, they've achieved a massive amount of market share. So there's some legitimate basis for it, but it gets a little out of control. The symptoms are an insular attitude. So there's less focus on competitors. If we're the leaders and if we didn't create it, we don't really care. We set the trend, so they stop looking at competitors. You can see there's a lack of competitive analysis as well. There's also a lack of participation in industry committees. So whereas others are more interested in hearing what's going on, they think, well, we don't really want to share what we're doing. We've got all the gold and we don't really have to attend. We're not going to learn anything anyway. And another aspect of this is that there's a lack of interest in market trends. Unless they initiated it, they don't see a new trend in the market as something threatening because they're so focused on themselves. There's also a lack of self-criticism. They tend to be very harshly reacting to any feedback that is perceived as being negative at all. And they're also overly praising of self. So there's lavish parties, there's massive perks. There's also an overestimation of strengths and underestimation of vulnerabilities. And you can see this as part of the strength, weakness, opportunity, threat analysis in the strategic plan. It's not as robust as it would normally be. Now, again, all killer risks have this quality. They're leading indicators of high severity risk events. I'm going to draw this for you. So on the y-axis here is success. And on the x-axis here is time. And here's the picture. Okay, so you start out here, you're nowhere, and you're just really struggling to survive. Then as time goes by, you're starting to become competitive, so you're competing. Then you get to the point where you excel, and at the top of the mountain you start to dominate, and then you're vulnerable to arrogance, and you get into that arrogance failure, and you start to go down that line. So this is the first case study, Swiss watchmakers. Some of you may be familiar with this. Because the Swiss were neutral during World War II, they kept making watches rather than putting their machinery into manufacturing military equipment. By the 1950s, the Swiss had 50% of global market share in watchmaking. That's massive. So they were at the top of the mountain here. Then along came Seiko. Japanese company Seiko introduced the quartz in watches in the late 1960s. The Swiss had a very arrogant attitude about their very complicated watchmaking and their engineers, and they refused to see the trends toward cheaper watches that kept better time. After about 20 years after the quartz came out, the Swiss had lost over 2/3 of their global market share. Even more egregious, I heard this story. I wasn't able to verify it by Googling, but I did hear this many years ago, that it was actually a Swiss company that came up with the first quartz watch. And an engineer had come up with it and showed it to management, and they said, look, come here. And they slapped them around. They said, look, you don't understand what we do here. Nobody wants this junk. They want this incredibly complex machinery. They appreciate the craftsmanship. They dismissed it. They didn't even bother to patent it. And they were showing it at a trade show, and the Japanese came along and said, what's this? And Seiko picked it up, patented it, and basically took away massive amounts of the Swiss business in watchmaking. So this last part may be hearsay, but I've heard stranger things happening. The second case study. This is the United States post-World War II. So the United States after World War II is feeling very strong, and a lot of success was in that success, arrogance, failure mode. And the Russians beat the United States into space with the introduction of Sputnik. And that scared people in the US, but with strong leadership and investment back into math and sciences and in education, the US became competitive in space again. This next case study is General Motors. In 1953, General Motors was the largest company in the United States, and it was one of the largest employers in the world. There's a famous quote by then GM President Charles Wilson. He implied in a quote that what is good for General Motors is good for America, and that's very classically arrogant. And for decades, GM was ignoring, and the industry in general was still fighting industry trends towards more fuel-efficient cars, losing market share nearly continuously. And finally, and this is an image here of the TARP bailout, they finally failed during the financial crisis, and they got bailed out after sustaining billions in losses. This type of arrogance in the Detroit auto manufacturers is a major driver in their having gone bankrupt. So who do you know? These are just a few examples. Do you know of any company, department, division, unit, or individual that currently fits this description? There's a reason why they were very successful. They got a little overconfident. They're proud of their achievements. Now they're vulnerable to arrogance and the character traits that can lead to disaster. So what can be done about this? This is a very difficult problem. In the killer risks discussions, we're not going to claim that we can present solutions to all these very difficult problems, but we're going to raise potential possible mitigation to partly mitigate the situation. So what can possibly be done here? Well, rather than focus on the behavior itself, which is very dangerous, focus on the weaknesses resulting from the behavior. So what you can see is, hey, we have maybe some unrealistic strategic plans, or we have a lack of competitive analysis, and focus on that. So let's take first the unrealistic strategic plans. One mitigation is you can integrate enterprise risk management into strategic planning. It identifies the disconnects in the plan, it clarifies what is in and what is not in the baseline, and it also validates the plan itself. So if you look at the strategic plan, so you got 3 periods in the plan. So if this here is the recent past, so you would need to normalize those results. This might be the strategic plan period, maybe 3 or 5 years, and then you have beyond the plan period. So the ERM helps you look at these areas here and finds if there's disconnects. So often you'll have that hockey stick, the famous hockey stick. So if results are been down lately, and the plan or a check mark shape. You get that check mark shape. So you can really question with ERM, there's techniques you can use to say, well, does this make sense? Are we really going to turn it around here? And what is at the junctures, is there a smooth transition? It helps you challenge the trend lines and look at patterns. Now I'm going to share with you a case study from an actual client of mine where they had a strategic plan, and they had 2 parts to the plan. They had a very high level projection of what their growth was going to be, and they reported that to the board. They had the more detailed part of their plan was actually working out because they're all sales force driven, how many salespeople, the sales plan, how many people they were going to hire, how many salespeople they were going to hire, what their retention of the salespeople was going to be over time, what the productivity level was going to be at different lengths of service of the salespeople, and the different mix of products that they would sell. So what we did in this approach, taking a value-based approach to enterprise risk management, which we teach in our Columbia program, we first used ERM to reproduce in the risk quantification phase of enterprise risk management. We first reproduced the strategic plan dynamically. So putting together all the pieces, what we were able to do was show the following. So the high-level plan showed that they were going to grow like this, and that was what they reported to the board. But in putting together dynamically the plan, all the pieces that they hung together, you get more of a shape like this, where in the beginning, yes, in fact, they were growing just like they expected, but then in the outer years, they were starting to level off and then shrink. So I was able to show the CEO and the CFO the gap here of how much shortfall they were going to have in revenue and earnings. So I asked them, well, which one do you want to go with? And you can understand which one they wanted to go with. They wanted to go with the higher level projections that they made to the board. But what we were able to do is dynamically use this tool, ERM as a tool, to guide the understanding and information and communications around what is needed. How many more salespeople do we have to hire? How much better do we have to get at retaining our good salespeople? What kind of productivity levels do we have to get up a little bit? And or what shifts in mix of business do we have to get to actually reproduce the growth that we expect to get? so they could really in advance be ready for and have a much higher level of success in executing the plan. And that's a very strong statement. So I want you to think about that, because many of you may be working with ERM programs, and most ERM programs don't actually do this. When it's not constructed optimally, what you have is more of a compliance focus, a downside focus. It's limited in terms of its influencing decision making. We're talking about influencing the most powerful decisions in the organization, the strategic plan itself. Another way that the ERM program helps strengthen the strategic planning process is, imagine these X's are risks, and they can manifest in many different ways. Upside scenarios, there's of course the baseline assumption for every risk. Downside scenarios, some risks only have a baseline and some downsides, like disasters maybe, and others have a range of scenarios. So what this process does is it helps you really understand what is actually in the plan. What have we committed to, and how could it go wrong over here in the downside scenarios? And how could it go more right? And when you do that, it teases out what have we actually committed to in the baseline, what is in and what is not in it. So what I just showed you was how the individual risk scenario development in enterprise risk management helps strengthen the strategic plan by understanding what is in baseline, what is not in baseline. I'm now going to draw you another picture which shows a very different story, but another example of how how the ERM process strengthens the strategic planning process. When you put together, remember we talked earlier about combinations. And the combinations, when you put them all together, you get this distribution of value or any other metric you want. You can make this revenue growth, or you can make it something else. What we have here is this distribution. Now, you can interpret it different ways. I'm going to draw in an area under the curve here. So if this is every possible value, and this is the baseline right here, these values over here to the right are where the value goes up, with a lot of positive upside scenarios start happening. The values down here are a lot of negative things start happening, maybe a couple together, and there could be offsetting ones. The area under the curve I'm drawing here might be, this might be when we're down 20%. So what are the odds are? The area under the curve here represents what are the odds of us losing 20% or more, and that might be, say, 15.4%. You can answer questions like that from a capital perspective, a value perspective, whatever. But the area under the curve here is a really interesting number that is, before ERM, never existed. And that is a quantitative expression of the likelihood of achieving plan. So we're able to explain how likely are we, what is the area under this curve, how likely are we to achieve plan? And maybe that is 31% this year. And then you can compare that to maybe last year, we had a 40% chance of achieving plan. And then people will say, well, wait a minute, why did it change from 40 to 31%? What parts of the business? So people may say then, well, why did it change? Why did it go from 40 to 31? The plan just got a lot harder to achieve. Why and where? And you're able to show, well, it's these certain business segments, it's the introduction of these other risks. And then people can start to make decisions. You can also compare risk-reward combinations. So it's a very powerful tool. The relativities are very important of the shifts in the business, but you actually have a quantitative expression to say how believable is the plan, and it's really very helpful. Just as one example, and this gets back a little bit to the individual risk scenarios, another client case study, where in looking at economic scenarios, we developed individual risk scenarios with subject matter experts that they had, and we said, give us deterministic scenarios that describe a range of all the different economic scenarios you expect, whether it's a double-dip recession, or slower than expected recovery, faster than expected recovery, whatever it is, give us all the upside and downside scenarios as well. When we finished, we compared it to their baseline plan. Remember, baseline, what you expect in the baseline strategic plan is also a scenario. We were able to show the CEO and the CFO, hey, look, and the chief risk officer, you've got every single one of these risk scenarios is actually an upside scenario. So it revealed something about the plan. In this case, the plan was overly pessimistic. And they said right away, we get it. And mid-cycle, they actually changed their baseline strategic plan to reflect a more realistic economic scenario is a little more rosy. So enterprise risk management, when done right, is not just about super downside. It's about all the downside and upside, but it helps level set the plane. Is it too unrealistic, one way or the other? Now we're going to talk about the issue of the lack of competitive analysis, and this is very straightforward. You can either recommend we increase the level of our competitive analysis, and this can be done directly through the business segments as part of their business strategic planning cycle to just do more competitive analysis, or you can indirectly address this through the corporate ERM area, take it into your purview as part of emerging risk identification. As part of emerging risk, you just have to keep an eye on competitors and embed some of that process within the corporate department or within other areas that have dotted line reporting into the ERM process.